I think the central technological transformation is the arrival of contraception. I think it's woefully underpriced just how radical a transformation that was. I mean, I've argued on a few occasions that the contraceptive pill was the first transhumanist technology, and that in fact, I mean, today, people there's been a lot of chat about transhumanism recently, and people think of us humans merging with machines, or giving ourselves robot arms, or grafting tentacles onto our faces, or something unhinged like that. But in reality, if we take as a sort of basic definition of transhumanism the idea that we can and should upgrade our human physiology potentially indefinitely in line with our desires, then the contraceptive pill is the first transhumanist technology, because that was it is a total paradigm shift in what medicine is for, because it doesn't set out to fix something that's wrong with me, like a broken arm or a kidney that's not working properly. It sets out to break something that's working properly in accordance with desire.
That's a fascinating line. Wow.
So the pill is the first transhumanist technology, and I remember I had a debate with a prominent writer on transhumanism, a pro-transhumanist writer, a very fascinating woman called Elise Bowen, who writes in her book Future Superhuman, which I recommend if anybody is interested in. As a swift rundown of where we are on transhumanism. She writes that female transhumanists are not very common, and I dissented. I said, on the contrary, the reason female transhumanists don't seem very common is because there are almost no female non-transhumanists. It's that they're so common they just don't register as such. Every woman who's on the pill is effectively a transhumanist.
Well, and the most salient vector of transhumanism for women was already invented and institutionalized across society. I mean, if there was a singular defining characteristic of women in any civilization, it's their ability to bear and rear children. I mean, that is the core engine of human reproduction. And so, well, it's done. It's in 1960s, we got it.
Job done. We are 50 years into the transhumanist era.
Yeah.
I mean, elsewhere I've characterized this as bio-libertarian, which perhaps a more useful way of thinking about it than transhumanist, which just sort of conjures up sci-fi imagery. But if we think about the idea of a libertarianism of the body that says we can do as we please with our own physiology, and I've set out to show that what began with a libertarianism of the body for women is now inextricably intertwined with the idea of with what we understand feminism to be, which is to say, I mean, under the bio-libertarian model, or the cyborg model of feminism, it's the idea that I should be limited in any meaningful way by my body, including by my normative reproductive physiology, is considered oppressive. I should be entitled to interrupt my normal physiology to, theoretically to infinity, in order to self-actualize in any way, in any way I see fit. And that begins with feminism, but that's really only the inception point. So what begins with feminism then legitimizes, an efflorescence of efforts to transcend our physical limitations, which is it's centered so far on efforts to transcend the limitations of reproductive physiology. But I see that really as just the starting point. And I mean, it's very easy. Conservatives are very fond of getting angry about transgender politics, but really I see the people who embrace transgender identities are doing so for the most part because they're suffering, and they believe that this will aid them. Transcending their physical limitations will give them some kind of
the pill
relief.
was much more affirmatively transhumanist than the transgender movement is.
It was. Yeah. I mean, but there's a genuine belief there that if I can only remodel my body in line with my desires, then my unhappiness will go away. And there's a deep tragedy, and I think the right could do with being a great deal more compassionate about what's happening there than particularly with young people who suffer a lot, I think. But in my view, these the transgender ideology is serving mostly as a sort of ideological wedge for a much broader project of deregulating human nature, deregulating the imago Dei, which still wields a great deal of sort of residual cultural cachet.
The one piece of this that I don't have a lot of insight on is what was the sort of social conception of the idea of contraception before the existence of the pill. I mean, it was obviously this like sudden titanic change in American society, but I just have no clarity on what the before was like. How did people talk about the idea of contraception before the pill?
Well, it depends which era you're pointing at. I mean, women have always sought to manage their fertility. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is a practical necessity. Mm-hmm. Childbearing is arduous. Women have always sought to manage their fertility to a greater or lesser degree. The origins of the pro-birth control movement are straightforwardly eugenicist. Mm-hmm. I mean, the progressives were openly eugenicist, as you know, as in general, until relatively recently. And figures such as Mary Stopes and Margaret Sanger in the United States were very open about their desire to propagate birth control as a means of breeding out what they considered to be defective members of the human race. So the early history of contraception is straightforwardly eugenicist, and particularly the history of the abortion movement was straightforwardly eugenicist. And it didn't gain traction until the eugenicists were able to hitch their wagon to the women's movement. At which point it stopped being about stamping out the disabled or the people with learning difficulties, and became about women's emancipation.
And so, do you think that how much of this, again, with the thesis being that ideology follows material reality, how much of the idea that childbirth is something that you can be emancipated from followed the sort of 100x ease of implementing that the pill created?
Yeah, I think. It seems difficult to picture. I struggle to imagine anybody taking seriously the idea that motherhood was something you could emancipate yourself from, or not without some difficulty, or not without a measure of self-discipline. Anyway, I mean, just sort of taking a detour back to the Middle Ages. One interesting factoid that I stumbled across a little while ago was the fact that a preponderance of the women who took holy orders in the Middle Ages were upper middle class. They were aristocrats or they were upper middle class. And I can't prove it because I'm not a medievalist and I don't, but my hunch is that most of these were basically blue stockings who just on balance decided if it was a straight choice between the life of the mind and being a mum, which it kind of was. Yeah. If you got married, then, you were being a mum. And who just didn't, they were like, I just want to be left alone so I can read books or press flowers or, make music or whatever. And so they took holy orders.
Yeah. What's the term blue stockings?
I'm sorry, that's a British term. The intellectuals.
I see.
Yeah, nerds. It's a polite way of saying female nerd that comes from the Bloomsbury group.
Yeah. Well, again, I love stuff like that because I think so much of one way you can analyze religion, especially kind of well-developed and hierarchical religions, is through the lens of social technology. And yeah, what do you do with your intellectual women? It's right, like, okay, right. Here you go.
I mean, I like reading. Yeah. I like reading. Had I been born in 1300, I probably would have taken holy orders.
Yeah.
If I'd been born in a middle-class household, I'd probably have opted to go and join a convent so that I could be left in peace to read. As it is, I'm blessed to be able to enjoy a life of the mind and also a family life, because the technological and the wider social and cultural and technological environment has changed in order to make that possible. But had I been born in a time where it was a straight choice, I probably would have gone for the convent.
Yeah.
Please don't say that to my don't ever play that clip to my daughter.
Yeah, we're not live, right? The pill gets invented. That was 50 years ago, 60 years ago. What's changed since?
Well, I mean, if the pill was the first transhumanist moment, we're considerably further down the same path since. And I think probably the salient pattern to follow, the line to follow through this is what the pill does, in the sense that if you use a technology to escape what was previously just a natural, understood as a given, use technology to bust through a given. I mean, we could take the example of the car. Prior to that, there were what we might have thought of as natural limits on how fast a human could go.
Right.
And the car came along and bust through that, and a whole bunch of stuff followed from that. Marshall McLuhan is great on this, the extending powers of technology. But what happens when you use tech to escape a given is invariably that as the the social structures that previously managed that fall away, the market moves in, because and so you get a dividend of freedom, which some people get to enjoy, and then you also get the and with that you get a whole load of new ways of buying and selling stuff.
Yeah.
So freedom and trade are two sides of the same coin, and you can't have one, notwithstanding a whole bunch of utopians who believed otherwise over the history of modernity. Mm-hmm. It's not true. It's not possible to have one without the other. Mm-hmm. And this is really what happened with the contraceptive pill. At a stroke, reliable contraception privatized sexuality, which had previously been inescapably socially managed, because society, pre-reliable birth control, the wider community really does have a stake in what I do and with who.
Mm-hmm. Because children end up being the responsibility of the entire community. Right,
exactly. It's a baby is not just my problem; it's also my extended family's problem.
The idea, what do you care about what people do in the privacy of their own bedroom, actually became operable as a governing tenet, in which case it just wasn't beforehand.
If I'd said, my body is my own business and it's nobody else's in, the 1750s, people would have just laughed in my face, because it's obviously not true.
Yeah, your 3 kids off to the side would have been like, what are you talking about?
Exactly. And it only becomes thinkable for the first time that sexuality is a private matter with the arrival of reliable contraception. But the thing about privatizing something is that if I own it, I can do what I want with it. Mm-hmm. And so what led to the dividend of freedom was the great many middle-class women such as me who went off to universities and joined professional and began to join the professional world and flourished in a great many ways, all of which are good. Mm-hmm. And for the avoidance of doubt, I'm not suggesting that women should all go back to the kitchen, because as if that's even possible, let alone desirable.
On that thread, how do you think of like pastiche trad in modern life? I mean, it's like, do you think
it's not trad enough? That's the problem.
Do you think people who pine for like trying to pantomime a pre-modern lifestyle? I
think there's a lot of different things going on there. One of the things which is going on there is straightforward status signaling.
I can, and therefore
right. Let's face it. Being a stay-at-home mum is a privilege now. And I only realised this when I got to the point where my peers, my NCT, all the mums who'd had babies around the same time as I had my baby started going back to work, and many of them expressed a really deep grief at having to be separated from their babies, and real ambivalence. It's a difficult moment, and this is in Britain, where that happens at 1 year old rather than 2 weeks, as is often the case in the United States. And I sucked at every profession that I attempted prior to having a child, and there was nothing I really wanted to go back to. So it wasn't a dilemma for me, but I was also in a position where actually I did have the option, because we were able to manage on my husband's income. And at that point I realized that actually having the choice this wasn't me being oppressed by the patriarchy. This was actually the fact that I wanted to be with my child and I had the option to do it. And the fact that we could afford to do that was not, it was very much the opposite of oppression.
Well, and the fascinating thing there is that there's actually sort of a complete inverted misalignment of incentive and desire in this modern status quo, right? Because the women who are most likely to, in previous eras, have been the blue stockings, take holy orders, upper middle class, wealthier people, are the ones who have the most potential in terms of just material resources to fruitfully raise children. And the women who otherwise would be more than happy to be homemakers and have the desire to have children are the ones least capable of doing so, because they are so reliant on the workforce.
And there's more, in the sense that it's typically the women who have the mic, and the women who are closest to the levers of power, and the women who are closest to being able to shape policy are typically those women who have careers rather than jobs. And I guess I was unusual in that sense, because as I said, I was terrible at every job I did before I accidentally became a writer at the age of 40. I was really, really, like, literally I get fired every 2 years. I was awful at all of them. And so I had jobs. And that's relatively unusual for a middle class Oxford graduate. and none of them were jobs that I really wanted to go back to. So I have perhaps more insight into what it's like having to go back to work after a baby if you have a job rather than a career.
Yeah.
And I can see why, if you have a career that you enjoy, that's well paid, and that you train for a long time, that gives you status and social connections and yada yada yada, I can see it would be a genuinely difficult decision. How to balance that with the love that you feel for your child, if you're a woman with a career. But I also look at I look at the women with jobs, and I think there's a lot of them, and they're not really getting much of a say. Because they just, because they have jobs rather than careers, they're not getting anywhere near the mic, and they're not certainly not getting anywhere near the levers of policy. And so absolutely without fail, what tends to happen, at the level of policy setting and institution building and rolling out actual concrete things that might tilt the wider social fabric in one direction or another, is that you see being presented as feminist and rolled out as feminist policies which aid the women with careers rather than the women with jobs. And then the women with jobs have to live with them. Even if in practice they're being emancipated, quote unquote, from their children in order to go and put packets through a scanner or take phone calls in a call centre, which is just, I don't know, it's not something I would have wanted to do over and above spending time with my baby.
So what does the internet do?
Where do we start? What does the internet do?
And I think it's worth breaking. I mean, we can use the sort of canned Web 1, Web 2, Web 3. I mean, it started in the early 90s. I mean, with the first advent of digital technology, what did it start to do to all of these existing social trends?
Well, it's kind of, it's an accelerant on, I'll just stop there. It's an accelerant.
An accelerant how?
Well, if we drill down a little bit into, let's go back to talking about bio-libertarianism, the transhumanist moment, which I guess is the kind of governing theme, and really is the moral and political order that marches now under the banner of feminism, which I've characterized as progress in the general sense, and which I think feminism should be opposed to. That's why I titled the book Feminism Against Progress. Yeah. Because in my view, to be a feminist is to be opposed to transhumanism and to be and as such to be opposed to progress. So if we look at what digital technology does to the transhumanist moment, it works as an accelerant, and it does that at the cultural level. It does it by entrenching and normalizing and propagating the belief that who we are is separate from our bodies. That it's possible, who I am as an individual and my body can be thought of as two different things. And I mean, this is I think the central reason why transgender politics has such a sharp age sort of caesura in it. And broadly speaking, anybody under the age of 30 is instinctively in favour of gender ideology, and certainly anybody over 40 has questions. And fundamentally, that's because if you're over 40, you can probably remember the before times. Whereas if you're under 20, the idea that there was ever a world without internet is just incomprehensible. And if you've grown up interacting with your friends in Minecraft or whatever, I'm old. I'm not gonna reference, the various online spaces where I might imagine kids to social. But if you've grown up inhabiting those spaces, it's much easier to imagine that who I am is something that isn't necessarily connected to my body, because I have a social persona which is not connected to my body. Yeah. And if you're accustomed to the idea that you can reskin that persona's avatar, then I can see how people might want to bring that out into the offline space as well, as the kids call it these days, meat space. And imagine that, if I can reskin my digital avatar, why should I not reskin my meat avatar? It starts to look intuitively like an issue of basic justice, that I should be able to shape myself as I see fit, because my me is self-evidently it's not the same thing.